Hello and good evening, everyone. Good afternoon if you're on the West Coast. Welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Very pleased tonight to welcome past fellow Simon Middleton from the College of William & Mary for tonight's session titled A History of Money in 9 Slides. My name is Andy Mink. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs at the Center. I want to welcome you tonight on behalf of my staff, Libby and Mike. In particular, I want to thank Mike for pinch hitting for me last week, the last webinar with Hollis Robbins. I missed my evenings with you, but I appreciate Mike leading a really fantastic conversation on the poetics of the enslaved. I also want to welcome you on behalf of our graduate student interns this spring. Hannah and Carly and Josh all work behind the scenes to develop the programming and the materials that we share with you. As you know, the center is located in Durham, North Carolina, and I have to be honest with you, it's a little bit more quiet there right now than it was when Simon was with us last year at this time. Of course, a year ago, we were just at the very beginning of understanding how the pandemic would affect our world and our livelihoods and our home lives and certainly our classrooms. It was very regretful, in fact, that last year's fellowship class that included Simon had to leave quickly and early once we realized that the public health would take precedent over our normal course of business. But in the time that he spent there, that all of our fellows spend at the center, they're really there, I think, to activate their expertise and their training and their perspectives to develop the humanities and to provide some sense of the emerging understandings of these complicated issues, these things that we talk about all the time. We walk around in our lives. They're sometimes invisible to us. Sometimes they're constantly on our mind. But this fellowship program really does give us access, us meaning the non-experts like me and you and folks who really work with younger people and with the general public to better understand these topics. So it gives us direct access to their expertise. And for that, we're very grateful and we're very pleased that we can bring it to you in this format. We also bring it to you in the form of free online resources. Please do take well advantage of your library card at the Humanities in Class Digital Library. This is a free and open education resource site in which all the resources you find that we create at the center and that our content partners have developed are yours to use and to modify and to adapt. It may well be, in fact, that this conversation around money and finance and currency is one that not only do you regularly address with your students, but you also sometimes maybe struggle with. And if that's the case, I'd encourage you to go and search for other resources that might help you illustrate and get a little bit deeper into this topic. For example, if you're an elementary school teacher, someone like Jenny, who's at Quintero Street Elementary School, you might find this resource on how to teach this concept of money to the elementary grades. Or if you're interested in understanding the historical perspective of currency, you might check out this recording of a previous webinar we did with Paul Otto on the history of wampum. Or it may be that you want to start to pull these together, particularly in the more contemporary conversations around currencies like Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. And if that's the case, we've got plenty of resources developed, not only with our partners, but with our folks at the center. I would encourage you to take advantage of discovering and finding and having access to all these materials and then entering in that community to develop your curriculum. The library is also where we develop and host the webinar series resources. I would encourage you to sign up for this group. It's called the Humanities in Class Webinar Series. And this is where we add all of the relevant materials and the resources that are aligned to each webinar session that will include the recording of tonight's session. So if you're interested in going back and taking a listen to this, spending a little bit more time on the content, this is where you'll find it. I've also asked Carly, one of our interns, to begin to segment our recording. So in addition to finding the 75 or 90-minute full version, you can also now find shorter versions that are edited by topic. So 10, 12 minutes that you might decide to share with your students, develop into a prompt, or otherwise put in your instruction. I'd also invite you to take a look at our webinar series calendar again. We've just added 3 new sessions, and I hope to see many of you in one or more of these sessions. On April the 7th, we'll be working with Michelle Zimmerman on understanding the role of artificial intelligence in our classrooms. On April 27th, we'll be joined by Edie Gels from Stanford University. she'll be discussing her really foundational work on John and Abigail Adams, in particular leaning on the Abigail Adams papers. And then we'll conclude this year's series with a visit from Nina Jekowicz. Nina is a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and she consults with and works with countries around the world to combat disinformation. And in particular, she'll focus on the role of fighting disinformation and misinformation in the era of controversies and pandemics. Please go and check these out. Sign up if you are interested in any of those topics. As always, also like to thank our Teacher Advisory Council. I see many of them in the room tonight. It's really their contributions and their conversation and their influence that helps us make sure that all of our work is relevant and meaningful for the classroom. And I hope that you find that to be the case tonight. So for those of you who are joining us for the first time, a couple of quick reminders and maybe look-fors as we engage in the webinar tonight. The first is there's a series of tabs right across the top of your PowerPoint screen. And one of those tabs says slides. So if for some reason you can't see the slides and you can hear our voice, make sure that slides is selected, and that will instantly make them visible. You can move in and out of those tabs though, so don't feel that you're going to disrupt the flow of us or anybody else in the room. You can use those tabs at your own discretion. If you do struggle with the audio, I would encourage you to make sure first that the audio is adjusted, the volume is up. And if you need to refresh your screen or even log out and come back in, it will not disrupt our recording and documentation of your attendance tonight. So you can do that and sort of troubleshoot on your own. And if you have any questions tonight, we would encourage you to interact with us using the Ask the Professor tab or the audience chat. And in both cases, I'll bring those forward and invite Professor Middleton to respond. So again, you have joined us tonight for the Humanities in Class webinar titled A History of Money in 9 Slides. I'm very pleased to be joined by Simon Middleton, Associate Professor of History at the College of William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, also a past fellow, the 2019-20, truncated asterisk year, but nonetheless as important as any. I'm also very pleased tonight to be joined by David Olson. David's a member of our Teacher Advisory Council. He'll be tonight's TA. He'll be dropping resources and links and questions in the audience chat as we move forward. So with no further ado, Simon, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Simon. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We've got a convivial and very active audience with us because that topic of money does bring folks out. It makes people want to sign up. And as we get started, and I'm going to turn the PowerPoint over to you in a moment, I wonder if you'd permit me to ask you a personal question to kind of start the session tonight.
You have to buy me dinner first, Andy.
I think I've done that. I'll buy you dinner again. Here's my question for you, Simon. As a parent, as a child at one point in our lives, as somebody who works with younger people, I think we all struggle with this concept of allowance. When you were a young boy, did you get allowance? And if so, what did that allowance mean to you? What did money mean to you when you were young Simon Middleton? You know, back when you were 7, 8, 9, 10, and you were either getting an allowance or perhaps even earning money for the first time.
That's out of left field. What was my relationship to money when I was a kid? I think the same as everybody else's. It's it gives you choices, it gives you independence, it allows you to join in and do things and participate. It's very important in terms of peer groups and being able to hang out. I tell you what, I've got a more powerful memory of not having money than I do of having money, actually, to be honest with you. Yeah. When the bills come through and you can't pay them, or when everybody's going out and you haven't got anything to go out with, and there's all that kinds of stuff. And I think a lot about my own children now, actually, and reflect on my experience when I was a student, and and I think it's a very powerful facet of our upbringing. I think our relationship to money, it can get us into a lot of trouble, and if we don't learn to manage it well, and it can also be a tremendous asset.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And as a parent as well, it's something you struggle with, right? Do you tie it to chores? Do you give it without strings? Do you impose some kind of arbitrary percentage that goes to this thing and that thing. But boy, getting that financial literacy and understanding early in life, that's got to set you up for a long time of success, it would seem.
Well, I think what we're going to talk about tonight is I think I'm going to make a kind of claim at this outset. I didn't think much about money until fairly recently, in the last few years, when I got working on this project. And I think that's what I want to get across tonight, is that I'm not sure we think about money very much. We mostly use it, and we miss it when we don't have it, and we celebrate it when we do have it. But I don't think we think about it enough, and that's what I want to do tonight. I want to think about it as and why it's. And I'm loving the contributions to the chat in terms of people answering that opening question about what is money and where does it come from. And it's the first time I've seen the OJs cited in respect of that question. So thanks for that. Thanks for that reference. I've forgotten who said it when it scrolled by, but thanks for that reference.
Well, thank you. We're looking forward to the conversation. Of course, all of our audience largely is teaching young people. And these are things, whether it's in the curriculum or not, we are modeling and conversing, and it's a part of teaching to help understand these big concepts. So thank you for leading the conversation.
Yeah, and actually, I'm really glad to see so many teachers, and especially from California, Los Angeles. It seems it's a big West Coast thing to sign on to North Carolina and on for these occasions. But because I have had the most fun with this, teaching this to in college to college kids and starting a conversation with them. And I think it's the most socially useful teaching I do when I want to have graduates leave the degree program being able to understand what money is, how it's used, where it comes from, its properties, and seeing their kind of eyes light up when they begin to work out a different view of how we can think about money is one of the most rewarding things I experience in the classroom, and I've taught it many years in the UK and now in the United States.
Great. Well, I'll turn over the slideshow to you, Simon. And again, I'll encourage our audience to drop questions either in the audience chat box or in the Ask Professor Middleton tab, and I'll bring those forward when the time seems appropriate.
Okay. Well, I mean, the first thing I want to do is what academics always do is change my title or apologize for not doing what I've said I would do in the title. Because we always get asked to do things, and then we say, yeah, I'll give a talk on this. And then years go by, and then it comes around, and my title was a boast at the National Humanities Center when I was there last spring to a banker and financier who I think is on the trustees and was down for a lunch. And I said, I can do a history of money from Mesopotamia to Bitcoin in 9 PowerPoint slides. And she said, right, I'll dare you to do it. Come to New York and do it in the fall. And then COVID hit, and the center closed, and the trip to New York got canceled, and I was left with this boastful and flashy title, but no talk, given or indeed written until this weekend when I was reminded by my diary that this event was coming up on Tuesday. So I've changed it because in talking with Andy and Libby and the other people at the center, they gave me the impression that, we want to have a conversation, and I want to hear from you in the chat box, and I'm already seeing really interesting stuff going by, and how people conceive of money and how we might talk about it. And I want to bring that into the session and make that very much part of the session, rather than me just talking and going through PowerPoints. I've managed to slim down my 9 slides to 4, and I will and can offer a kind of very brief and truncated history of money at some point later on today. And I'm happy also to talk about my own research, which is on the history of money in colonial America, mostly in Pennsylvania and New York, and in particular, the introduction of paper currencies in the 18th century. But I'd like to start with a confession and I've given you an outline of the proceedings, but something of a confession. I want to emphasize that my focus is on the history of money rather than a comprehensive consideration of all aspects of what, by any agreement, is a very complicated and difficult topic. The great economist, probably the greatest economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, is reputed to have once declared that, quote, I know of only 3 people who really understand money: a professor at another university, one of my students, and a rather junior clerk at the Bank of England. And my understanding, such as it is, comes from of this topic comes from looking at the history of money in early America in the 17th and 18th centuries, as I've said. And I'm keen to stress at the outset that I am not an economist. My understanding of some of the more arcane economic theories relating to money is limited, to say the least, and distinctly the perspective of a layman. So, having put that out there, I want to turn it into a positive, because I think what I want to make, the point I want to start by making tonight, is that when we study and money in historical context, like the early modern period, which is what I'm predominantly going to be concerned with, it actually predates the creation of what we know today as economics and who we know today as economists, who, in my view, don't really get going until the middle of the 19th century and arguably until the 1890s, and whose ideas and concepts and arguments are very much a late 19th and 20th century affair. So it's kind of fun to go back and read about people like John Locke, the famous English philosopher of the 17th century, and Benjamin Franklin. Of course, you all know Benjamin Franklin, and David Hume, another philosopher, who talked and wrote quite a bit about money and its social and moral effects and implications, but none, I think, would have thought of themselves as economists. And even those who are claimed as the forefathers of modern economic theory, including luminaries like Adam Smith, took a very different approach to the topic than that favored by modern economists and economic theory, being as much concerned with moral philosophy as they were with supply and demand curves and inflation and the quantity theory of money and so forth. And a large part of my interest in this topic is a desire to try and increase conversations and debates amongst people a bit like the people who are gathered here this evening, I'm supposing, unless there's economic theorists out there in the audience, people who are interested in the topic but not, experts in the rather arcane arguments that are often made in places like universities, and want to have a debate in the way in which actually they had a debate in the early modern period in the 17th and 18th century about money, about its relationship to the economy, and about how we organize our economic and social life. And I think these debates, we need to broaden these beyond the sphere of economic theory, I think, because of where we're going in modern times with climate change and the whole question about COVID and after COVID and all the rest of it, which are debates that we need to be involved in, I think, as citizens and as people who are interested in understanding how the world works. So I wanted to start, and you've already begun this, I think, in the chat, because I wanted to start with this deceptively easy question about what is money and why is it so important. Not simply because we want to buy things and go shopping, but why is it crucial to social life, right? And I've seen, I'm not sure if we can have if whoever's running the chat can come up with a few responses from the many that I saw scrolling by. I did get a sense, I think, of a kind of the tenor of those remarks. Well, and I will try and cast that. But if you could just have a dig around, Andy, and find a few examples of the people who've made the contribution so far, that would be helpful.
I'm definitely going to do that. Thank you. So permit me, audience, for a moment. I'm going to scroll up, as all of you can do as well. And I'm going to pick just a handful that I saw come through. Let's start with Erica. Erica, one of our first responses says, money is currency a group of people agree on. I think it originates from a group of people who all decide a particular form of currency will hold power in their society. Here's a second one. This is from Sherilyn. Sherilyn says, money is currency. It can be a fiat money or in some form of physical exchange like gold. It is something that any parties that have interest would agree upon to exchange or purchase something with. Now let's move down a little further. What we're also doing, by the way, is moving around the country. Diane, who's joining us from Louisville, Kentucky, notes that money is a means of universal exchange, but also a way of assigning social value. Our good friend Christopher, who is with us many times, many webinars, says, money is an item used as payment for goods and products. He believes it originated from ancient civilizations when they used to barter and exchange goods for trades. Just one or two more for you. I'm going to scroll down and try to get something that are maybe a little bit different. This is from Tisha. Tisha is joining us from Connecticut. Money is a social construction that reflects an aspect of what we as a society value. There are things that, quote, money can't buy. And then here's the last one for you, Simon. Let's see. I'm going to go with, let's see. I'm trying to find, here's a great one. I'm going to conclude with this one. This is from Carrie. Carrie's in Los Angeles. Carrie's daughter is 11. And when Carrie asked her daughter replied, money grows on trees because it is made of paper, and paper comes from trees.
Very good. Carrie. Yeah, Carrie. I think Carrie, gets the prize there. So that is really interesting, and a really varied group of responses, which I'm kind of hearing. Money is a thing. It's an item. It's currency. I mean, when somebody says money's currency, my next question is, okay, so what's currency? It seems to be, to me at least, that people are talking about money as if it's a thing. People are talking about it in relation to trade, an exchange, and people are talking about it in relation to barter. Now, how many people, I don't know, there's no way, if I was in a classroom, it would be a raise a hand, but it's a bit difficult in this format. But does anybody now want to take on talking about or making a contribution based on any of the reading that I set? Now, this is the test to see whether you've done your homework, class. Does anybody have a response in relation to the Felix Martin chapter or the article by Barry Eichengreen that was in the Guardian last week that Andy circulated? Or if you didn't read any of these texts, how do you think about money in relationship to the contemporary situation? For example, is there any real difference between the Dems and the Repubs on budgets, and how are we going to cover the costs of COVID? And is it possible for the country to run out of money? All of these kinds of questions present themselves once we've started thinking about money. I'm not sure if that's too much or whether we'll get any responses on that.
I think we'll get a lot of responses, Professor. I'll tell you what. Let's choose one of them, and we'll pause for a moment or two and let the audience catch up with us. Mm-hmm. Let's go with the question in contemporary context in 2021. Yeah. I'm trying to condense much of what you've just said. Tell for the audience. Tell us how money is used politically. Is that what you're going for?
Well, I'm just. The reason, what I want to get to is the idea that which I got to when I started thinking about this topic. I mean, it's teachers will recognize this, I'm sure, but my entering undergraduate class this year at William and Mary were 5 years old when the financial crash hit, and so they've kind of grown up in a world which is defined by that event and post facto. And then we have COVID as well. And I think that this is a time when our relationship to money and our relationship to the government and what they do with money is really in turmoil, right? And I'm just interested in I'm seeing how people out there feel about that, because it was that was the thing that took me into this topic. I had been working on various themes within early American history for several years, but after the financial collapse, the way in which I saw massive deficits run up and this terrible news coming out of politics, and then I saw the bailouts, and I just found it really difficult to square. How can we have massive deficits over here and then massive bailouts over here? How is money working? And I just wondered if anybody else connected to that kind of thing in the last decade or so, and then now we've got COVID and we're facing, I just think it's a really interesting and now kind of topic. And then I just want to get a couple of responses to that kind of, throwdown, and then I will pick it up and start explaining my position a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't want to try to reword that. I think you said that well, and I'm anxious for our audience to respond directly to that prompt. And it does seem, just from my own perspective, that you're also getting us to think about the difference between money to us individually and money that's being used on a massive national scale. Money, sort of words like deficit and trillions and trillions. That means absolutely nothing when you're going to Harris Teeter with your debit card trying to buy the week's groceries. Like, the concept of money changes quite a bit. So let's see what how folks respond to you. And we'll go from there. Armin, thank you so much for your thoughts. Robert, I'll get to your question in just a second for sure.
I like Shraddha Kapadia. I like that response. Yeah.
Why don't you read it?
Hello from Los Angeles. I think money is a medium of exchange. It allows for an idea of value, places on material items and goods that can be purchased. It, in a way, creates a systemic system which allows for taxation to serve a community or a governing body. It also creates class systems within the population. So all I wanted to do was to start out the evening by, asking a fairly innocent question, which got fairly innocent answers at the beginning. Money was, some people said it's, cocoa beans, it's a thing, it's shells, it's ancient, it's, it's about status, it's about trade. And I think Shraddha has also introduced this idea of money as a medium of exchange, which actually names a really important function of money. And I often start classes when I'm teaching this to undergraduate students, asking them the same question: what is money? And they usually come up with similar kinds of responses in terms of thinking about it as a material thing, thinking about it as currency, thinking about it as a particular function, like a medium of exchange, of course associating it with barter and with trade and with all of these kinds of things. And that's what I did when I first started thinking about it. But it turns out, I just want to make two observations about what everybody's already contributed to the session so far, which is that, isn't it interesting, and I think, noteworthy, that when we start actually thinking about money, and after a relatively short exchange with people in the session, it just becomes a lot more complicated than we kind of treat it on a daily level, right? Our engagement with it on a daily level, in a daily way, we don't think about all of these kinds of things when we're just going through our life and paying our bills. But money, it seems to me, is a little bit more complicated than we give it credit for, or there's no pun intended there. But and I'm interested in that relationship between how we use it just every day, take it for granted, and actually how it is created and managed, and it's and what it is at the end of the day. And that's what I want to explore in the kind of in the remaining time, because I think the way that I see money is a series of interlocking functions. And I think the breakthrough moment for me was seeing money not as a thing, not as a material thing that people get used to by habit and so forth and so on, but seeing it as a series of interlocking functions. And there are, three or four particularly powerful ones that people have usually emphasized. First and foremost, it's come up in a couple of the comments. It's a measure of value, or it's a measure of account, and that's going to be really important in a conversation as we go forward. And then a second function, equally important, is the one that Shraddha just came up with. It's a medium of exchange, right? It represents and symbolizes value and allows you to pass value across time and space reliably. But in our context and now, it's also a store of value, right? And it's also a way of it's also a means of settlement. And when you put these four functions together, all of which give money its moneyness, it becomes easier to think of it as less of a thing and more of as a relationship, or a social technology. And that's the phrase that Felix Martin uses in the chapter that I said. And I think he kind of borrows that from an older sociological debate. But it's a social technology for the distribution of value. And as a social technology, as a series of functions for that distribute value, it's something that, appears to me at least to be pretty artificial, something that we should be able to manage, something that we create collectively and so should be able to use. But I'm interested in the way in which so many debates about money are always telling us what we can't do because we've not got any of it, or we haven't got enough of it, or we'll lose it, and all of that kind of stuff. And I think I want to start by getting inside that relationship between the complexity of money and the way that we naturalize it and the way that we make it usable by not thinking about all of those difficult questions. Let me move on to another slide. Yeah. So there's a historian called Rebecca Spang, whose book I've put up there, which is a great book on money in 18th century France. And she has got a really great way of introducing this idea of the complexity of money, but then how we literally, we use it without worrying about all of these complexities. Witness how easy, for example, people have shifted from pound notes and coins to contactless payment. I read in the paper the other day that soon, like your face turns your phone on, soon you'll just go and look at a screen and they'll make the deduction from your account based on your face. And we just move through these quite radical changes, and we continue to use money without being too disturbed by it. And in fact, it only really works well when we have confidence in this system. Yeah. And Rebecca Spang makes the point at the start of her book, describing this process of taking money for granted, treating money as a natural and self-evident thing, as a mythologizing of money. And she cites a literary critic called Roland Barthes and his observation that it's in the essence of myth to transform history into nature and to strip reality of its historical determinants. And what that means is, I think, what I'm trying to say in a long-winded way, is that we rarely think about money in its actual and specific context in history or in contemporary time. What is it? Actually, there's lots of different views of that on Evidence of this evening. And how is it made and managed? Some people have said the government makes it. Some people have said the banks make it. But who's in charge and what are their priorities? If it's an artificial managed resource that serves certain social functions, then who's deciding what we're doing with the money that we are making? And if it's a measure, then we'll get to that. We'll get to that. If it's a measure, how can we run out of it? Is the question. So in this form, and I've seen some evidence of this in the chat as well. Money is taken for granted and understood in common sense and aphoristic terms. Money is the root of all evil. It's the bottom line. It's what burns a hole in our pockets. And talked of in these ways, I think this is what allows politicians, for example, to talk about us running out of money. Now, no serious economist would think that a nation that has a central bank and controls its own currency can ever run out of money. And we all suspect that, right? When they tell us that the deficits are enormous and we're in danger of running out of money, as George Osborne did in England after the crash. And then they find, hundreds of billions. You're like, well, where's that come from, right? And it's this. We only notice money and these decisions when things go awry, right? When there's a problem. And I think in normal times we just assume money's a natural and self-evident thing. This is one of the reasons it's so hard to track in history, because we impose our notion of money back on an earlier time when when you look at it more carefully, turns out they had their own notion of money, and often looks a bit weird how they had money, especially in early America, when their money was very different from the money that we have today. And this was the point that really got started on the research for the book that took me to the NHC. And I'm happy to take questions now or have a pause before I get into my 4 slides, and I will actually try and account for the long-term history and derivation of our money as we understand it today. Because I got to this point in my thinking, and I was determined to do the research project and look at how early Americans conceived of and used money, and try and establish how it was different from the way that we conceive of and use money, and how we got from where they are to where we are. That's the kind of project of the book. But I also wanted to understand, how we came up with our concept of money, and where that came from, because it is specific in time and space. It's not, it's not enduring. And one of the ways that we obscure that is, and I've seen lots of comments on this. Money originates, back in ancient lands, and we're still using it in a similar way, or there's a connection between how we're using it and there. But in fact, we're not. It's actually very different, and there are really powerful and important changes in how we conceive of and use money. So I'm not sure whether you want to come in, Andy, on that.
Yeah, I do. I do want to ask one question, but of course, okay. If I bring something forward that you're going to address in a few moments, then please, you can put a pin in it. But what I'm hearing you say, and what really is a fascinating part of this is this evolution of money as a concept, that it's very it's very contextual, it's very responsive to not only the temporal piece, when, but also where, in terms of country and time, et cetera. But in my own life, it seems like the relationship and understanding that we have with money has been severely affected by the rise of the credit card and debt. So I'm going to take Robert, and I'm going to tweak it just a little bit to ask you to speak just a little bit about the concept of debt in the same way that you have about money and currency. And in fact, his question is, has debt changed our relationship with money? Is that something that's really affecting the way that we see it today in 2021?
Well, I also saw a question from about barter, and was that a significant thing? I'm going to get into this in a minute, but I'm happy to open, respond to both those ideas or questions before we start out. One is, I think when you reconceive money as in terms of the functions that it performs and the way in which it distributes value, debt and credit and public finance and tax and trade, are all part of the same story in the modern context. And debt is not, is far from a new thing. And certainly, a national debt is far from a new thing. It's certainly in the United Kingdom, and I'm going to tell you about the establishment of the Bank of England, and the United Kingdom has had a national debt since it was created by the Bank of England in 1694, and the United States has had a national debt since Alexander Hamilton created it after the Revolution, when he created the first Bank of the United States. So, national debt is never going to go away, right? And that's one of the great mythologies that you can it would be a bad thing if we got rid of it, because it would suck a lot of value out of the economy, and we need that value. So I don't think debt's a problem, actually. It's managing debt is the problem. And managing debt in an international marketplace where you depend on, people backing you. But that takes us away from the history of money that I want to talk about and where it came from, and into debates within, modern, political economy and political and economic theory. And the barter point made by somebody, it's one of the great myths that money follows. And yeah.
Simon, go ahead and unplug your headphones real quick. I think we just got that static we were worried about. Are you back? So to the audience, Simon and I talked during our run-through about his computer and headphones, and he said that, after using them, teaching Zoom all the time, he notices that they get static right at the very end, and he was going to unplug them and plug them back in. Simon, by doing that, you might have disrupted your connection, so I'm going to ask you to drop out and come right back in, and in the meantime, I'll entertain the audience and give you a chance to reconnect. Thanks, Natalie. I know that all of you, particularly those of you teaching in a blended environment, understand the way that your rhythm and your tone can be disrupted by a technical glitch just like that. The thing is, we knew this was coming. Now we just need to get Simon plugged back in. Hey, Simon, are you with us? Perla, thanks so much. I appreciate your patience. Imelda, it's nice to have you join us. I love having the cross-curricular connection. Jose, the readings are in the webinar resource folder in the digital library. When you get reminders, by the way, we always put the direct links to those folders. And if some of you come to our sessions and you don't realize that there's some pre-readings and resources that our professors develop in advance, that's always where you can find it. There'll be not only a link in the reminder email that you get from the GoToWebcast session, but also you'll be able to go to the Humanities in Class webinar folder and you can find it as well. So Robert, believe me, I could and can sing an ABBA song, but that's the last thing you need. And when we document your session tonight, your time tonight, the last thing you want to do is put the palindrome band ABBA on the documentation. So I'm going to pass on that.
I'm back.
There he is. Hey, Simon.
Sorry, guys.
It's all right. I forgot to warn you that it's just a function of the platform. If you disconnect, then you have to actually reboot the whole thing. So thanks for being.
No problem.
You saved me. I was just getting ready to entertain Robert's dare and challenge to sing an ABBA song.
Oh, I think I should disappear again. I think that people would much prefer that.
I'll buy you 2 dinners now. Okay.
Let me get on and promise do what I should, because we're running out of time here. So I'm going to talk about money in 4 slides and how we get to where we are today. Historians trace money's origins to the fertile lands of the Tigris and Euphrates river systems in the area comprising modern day Iraq and Iran, and the beginnings of settled human civilization in circa 8000 BCE. So at the very beginning, here we have pre-literate communities, and before they develop writing or Sumerian script, they first develop counting. And they use these geometrically shaped clay tokens to represent different commodities and units so as to track payments of temple monies or tithes, tributes, and things like funerary goods. And so the work was done by Denise Besserat, the lady whose reference I've given at the bottom of the page. And she worked out the entire kind of counting system based on studying these tiny tokens, which people had thought were maybe jewelry or game pieces or something, but she worked out it was a form of counting, and it was a major breakthrough. And so it's left to right, that top left is 1 length of textile, then it's 1 jar of oil, 1 measure of wheat, and so forth and so on. Now, the style and use of tokens in this way continued largely unchanged across various ancient civilizations for the next 5,000 years or so, right? Providing for the development of varieties of what scholars call primitive money. That is the use of tokens or commodities or other objects with sufficient degree of uniformity that they could be used in payment and recognized as customary or otherwise valid forms of currency or money, right? And it's interesting to note that in these forms, these primitive monies were most often featured in ritualistic payments for devotional tithes, compensations for injury or Wehrgeld, dowries for marriages, and so forth and so on, and only secondarily for trade. So money develops in its original format, first and foremost, foundationally, as a measure of account and a value. And it's a way that you can say to the temple bosses that you've paid your whack for this harvest, or whatever. That's how it begins. Zoom forward to 700 BCE, and the Lydians of Greek and Asia Minor, and they introduced a significant innovation when they produced tokens that are made out of electrum, which is a naturally occurring silver alloy. This endows the accounting tokens with intrinsic value that can not only measure and facilitate the transfer of value, but also serve as a store of value. If you collect them up, they're worth something. For the first couple of centuries, these early coins, as they would become, bore the names of places and mottos and the images of gods. But around 500 BCE, they start to feature images of rulers, sometimes in heroic poses, and they become associated with particular dynasties. So Alexander the Great mints coins to fund his military campaigns, and the Romans used coins throughout the empire until the fall of Rome, when the use of coin became less common in Europe, especially in Britain, until the 7th century CE. So we move on, that's tile 1, to medieval times through Renaissance Italy, because various coins and tokens are used and circulate, and denominations of the shilling and the sou develop as monetary measures of account in coins circulating throughout Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Some of these coins travel long distances, particularly the denier, a Frankish silver coin, which was the forerunner of the English silver penny, introduced in the 8th century. Beginning in the 12th century, English sovereign mints produced coin valued according to the monarch's will and at a set price. So if you're a wealthy landowner, I'm sure that the audience is filled with wealthy landowners and merchants, you would send your bullion to the mint to be recast into coins because it was much more convenient for payments and trade. And for this service, the sovereign would extract a fee or seigniorage, derived from the difference between the intrinsic metallic worth of the coin and the cost of its production and the denominated or face value. So you get a binary here between metallic worth of something and the face value, the denominated value or nominal value. And now, as you can imagine, disagreements over the level of seigniorage was pretty common. It had been a problem since the days of the Roman Empire, when penny-pitched emperors would adulterate the fineness of the silver and manipulate face values to increase their take. These pogroms persist in medieval Europe when variances in silver values, say between England and France, prompt merchants to hoard bullion or take it overseas because they can get a better deal for the minting. The competition for specie to retain supplies of silver and to a lesser extent gold, because it was more scarce, becomes central to the struggle to maintain a supply of good money. And so does a concern for a favorable balance of trade, so that one is not sending specie out by buying imports, but retaining it and earning and attracting it by selling your exports. In the 16th and 17th centuries, this competition is intensified by the flood of New World silver, mainly from the mines in Potosi in Peru, and gold, which flood the monarch through the Spanish Empire, flood European markets, and bring about new levels of market activity and consequentially of booms and of busts. Sovereign finance and the needs to supply a supply of money also inspire the other big early modern change, the invention of banks. The Medici Bank in 15th century Florence is a particular example. And these were places where merchants could register various debts and credits in a single register and then rely on the bank as an intermediary to clear accounts and also to provide loans for those with spare money or credit to offer, especially to powerful families and royal houses. So that's the second tile. Third tile coming up, which is the beginnings of modern money and the central banking system, which is in England, conveniently for me. At the turn of the 17th century, as English courtiers and merchant investors and zealous Protestants turned their attention to New World ventures, their conception of how money was made and managed remained much the same as it had been for the preceding 400 years. The sovereign made it, decided the nominal value, and the thing I just described. So, for example, faced with unrest in Ireland in 1601, Elizabeth I minted new pennies with less real silver content to pay the troops for putting down the rebellion. And she made these new lighter coins, quote, the lawful and current money in the Kingdom of Ireland, while the older and heavier coins lost currency. So when an Irish debtor sought to pay off an English debt with the new lighter coins, the English creditor was very upset and sued. In 1605, by which time Elizabeth had gone and James I was on the throne, the Privy Council made a very important ruling in the case of mixed money. It affirmed that, quote, money inheres in the bones of princes, and that the king by his prerogative may make money of whatever matter and form he pleaseth. So may he change his money in substance and impression, and enhance or debase the value of it at his pleasure. So this is the sovereign creating money, taking a fee and deciding the difference between those intrinsic value and nominal value. And this is the struggle that's been going on for centuries. What's fascinating is by the end of the 17th century, and there will have been a systematic rethinking and which sweeps aside these long-standing assumptions in favor of a conception of money with which we're more familiar, which is artificial, dynamic, elastic, and able to promote investments and schemes with the potential to strengthen the state. And in England, these new ideas took root in debates concerning the perennial problem of the shortage of coin, which limited credit, which hampered growth of the realm's burgeoning domestic and overseas trade. The English civil wars, prompted in part by the Stuart monarchy's fiscal incontinence, had also inspired radical religious and political ideas, which led commentators, especially a group of smarty pants people associated with a guy called Samuel Hartlib, who was at Oxford. He was a German, but he lived at Oxford. And they started to consider the use of paper money as a stimulus that might activate previously dormant resources, and thus increase the stock of wealth and encourage mankind's pursuit of improvement and perfection of nature, self, and society. Whiz forward to 1688, the Glorious Revolution, the collapse of the Stuart dynasty, thank God, because they were just troublemakers. The new monarchs, William and Mary, my namesakes at the college where I now work, good for them, they need a victory, or at least an honourable peace, to secure the Protestant succession against the war they're in war with France, where James II had fled, and they need a victory to secure their claim and the Protestant succession. And they're backed by a coalition of merchants and parliamentarians who are none too sure that they're actually going to pull off the victory. And so they make a deal. And what happens is that they create the Bank of England in 1694, under which, the terms of which, the sovereign basically cedes the right to make money and control value to the Bank of England, which is financed by private capital, and introduces a novel private-public partnership whereby private capital establishes the bank, makes loans to William and Mary, who fight the French, and then make their payments using taxes. Meanwhile, the bank also issues its own paper notes, backed by sovereign authority and metallic reserves, or the silver in the vault. And these notes meet the rising demand for credit and secure additional revenues for the bank. And they basically create the circumstances in which they unleash a wide-ranging financial revolution which underpins the power of the emerging English military fiscal state. And it creates Europe's first widely circulating paper currency. And it's transformative for English fortunes. If you look at European history in the late 17th century and you were having a bet on who would come out on top in the next 50 years, you would have backed France all the way. And it's actually England and Britain that comes out, and France that has the difficult 18th century, loses the 7 Years' War and then has a revolution at the end because of it. The monarchy is in such a state of disrepair. And it's English credit and the combination of the fiscal and military state that's bankrolled by this financial revolution that really provides the kind of surge for English, the rise of the English state and English power in the 18th century. And this is something that Alexander Hamilton, who was a great student of political economy, knew very well. And this is exactly where he got his idea from after the revolution for his report on public credit. Now, the final tile, I guess, is as important as the political and institutional innovations that created the central bank, was the changing view of money that it was issuing and that it was dealing with. And the changing view, it drew upon preceding decades of debate, and it cast a long shadow thereafter, in as much as it lays the groundwork for our modern conception of money as primarily a medium of exchange. That is otherwise incidental to increasing and decreasing actual value. It's a complex development, but in summary, key thinkers such as John Locke, David Hume, and Adam Smith broke with this long-standing conflict between unit and weight, which I described earlier, between nominalism, which emphasizes face value, and metallism, which emphasizes intrinsic value. And instead, they treated money as if it was a special kind of a commodity that developed seemingly spontaneously in the marketplace. The idea of a barter and then the spontaneous development of money to solve the inconveniences experienced by barter is a myth that goes back to Aristotle and turns up every now and again in discussions of money. Anthropologists argue that they can find no real examples of that kind of behavior. People traded using commodities, but they had always a sense of a measure of account. So to that extent, and going back to the foundational function of money as a measure of account, it wasn't true barter. It's not like you're changing, goat's cheese for tins of tuna and pairs of shoes. You're realizing the value of those different commodities, and then you're exchanging using that value measure. So it is actually still a monetary transaction. These guys developed a conception of money which treated money as a special kind of commodity, the value of which, as bullion, ebbed and flowed. So silver money, the value of that ebbed and flowed according to supply and demand, and that was beyond the reach of governments, but which also, at the same time, also served as a symbolic token and a measure of account with which market participants could reconcile the worth of endlessly variable goods and services through the mechanism of pricing. So though David Hume affirmed that insofar as the value of money depended upon bullion, it lay beyond the reach of government and was determined by the balance of trade or the mechanism that he wrote about and discovered, which is called the specie flow. And there's no point hoarding all the bullion that you can get your hands on, because all that does is drive up prices in your domestic market, making your exports more expensive and imports cheaper. So then your silver money will naturally flow out to the markets where it can buy where it's most effective to purchase. But he also said, insofar as money tokens serve as a medium of exchange, they are, quote, not properly speaking one of the subjects of commerce, but only the instrument which men have agreed upon to facilitate the exchange of one commodity for another. It is none of the wheels of trade. It is the oil which renders the motion of the wheels more smooth and easy. And it's from this era that we get the sense of money as a mere medium of exchange, which if you increase or reduce the quantity of money tokens, you can send prices up or prices down, but you're not going to substantively alter the underlying real values and balances in the economy. That's inflation and deflation, right? Trade is something else. For Adam Smith, money contributed to national wealth because it provided for the circular flow of investments, rents, wages, and spending. So the changing conception of money and this emphasis is part of an emphasis on what sociologists Jeffrey Ingham calls rational utility maximization. The idea that people use money to get ahead was crucial to the arguments that were being made by advocates for the emerging commercial society and early capitalism. It was a conception of money that bolstered dissent from established orthodoxies regarding the preeminence of land as a source of wealth and the virtues of state regulation of trade that aimed at accumulating ever larger amounts of available bullion, or indeed going on expensive adventures and wars overseas trying to get territory from other powers. As earlier argued, the use of money as a medium of exchange pointed up the possibilities for the creation of new wealth from the introduction of improvements and of manufacturing and the development of new markets, activities that promise to yield vast quantities of value over and above the value already collected in rents and stored in precious metals. And it's this which launches a kind of competing argument of political economy in the 18th century, within which in America the colonies figure mightily. And there's a guy called Steve Pincus at Chicago who wrote a book called The Heart of the Declaration, which I recommend, which is it's a short and easy book to read, and it's a statement of a nice clear statement of this kind of argument, that there's people who are emphasizing land and wars and collecting specie, and then there are people who are saying no, it's about free trade, it's about developing new markets, it's about using not slave labor, it's about using free labor because they consume more and they provide a market as well as a labor force. All of these arguments that will develop in the 19th century into the big row between free labor and slave labor in the antebellum period grow out of this political economy and changing conceptions of money in the 18th century. In the new view, it made no sense for individuals and nation states to concentrate on military spending and amassing territory and bullion, and rather better to use their money as capital to invest in commercial opportunities and competitive advantage realized by the division of labor, economies of scale, free trade, which promised greater and to some seemingly endless profits. And this is the conception which forms the basis for the debates in the 19th century, during which time economics appears as a discipline on its own. And through different versions of the debates relating to how money should be made and managed, and on whose interests it depends, as we move through the 19th and the 20th century, whether it's the case made for and against artificial limits on the money supply, such as the gold standard, which keeps money scarce and so favors creditors, or more inflationary approaches, which are regarded as favoring debtors by increasing the money that's in circulation. And if you're interested in that, there's another great book. I think I've done a tile actually with reading at the end there. Robert Skidelski, that book came out recently, and it's a really great and readable. Skidelski is the biographer of John Maynard Keynes, and he's actually sits in the House of Lords as a crossbench peer. And it's a fascinating discussion about money and government and where we're at today. So I think that I'll stop there. And I can talk about more stuff in early America or whatever, but Andy, I'll let you back in if you're still there.
I am still here, thank you. And we do have about 20 minutes left for questions and for continued conversation. It's been a nice sort of turn of focus to look at the historical evolution, to look at the ways in which this context is both in other countries and soon in America. There are a couple of questions in the queue that I'd like to bring forward and invite our audience to type some in. One of them is about the use of money or coins as propaganda. Robert's curious if you can speak a little bit to that role of propaganda in money.
I can. I also saw one on Bitcoin, which I'd also take as well, because I think that's fascinating. I mean, I think what I find so fascinating about the creation of paper currency in the colonies is that, think about this: you are a provincial government. You are supposedly under the power of an imperial government, which is in London and distant, and you take it upon yourself to start manufacturing paper notes, which are effectively monetizing the value of the land and labor in a place like Pennsylvania in the 18th century. And you put out a piece of paper and it says the province of Pennsylvania, current money value 5 shillings or whatever, and then people use it to buy stuff and pass around. I think that that piece of paper becomes a really powerful statement about an autonomous organization of your affairs. Yeah, the people who are using that piece of paper only use it if they have confidence that it will be accepted. And by using that piece of paper, they are expressing confidence in the effectiveness of their provincial government, and they're being bound into that kind of a relationship. So actually, money is all about the political relationship between a government and its subjects, right? A lot of the times, there is a really powerful relationship between taxes and money, for example. And in the colonies, they have a public finance crisis because they've got to pay for defenses and they've got no revenues. So by issuing, paper, so they can pay soldiers and the militia, and they can buy supplies for the army and so forth, and then having people pay their taxes in that paper back, they create a more powerful, I think, governmental bond between subjects and colonial governments. And they also tread on the toes of the imperial authority, who doesn't recognize the colonial money as legitimate, but nevertheless has to deal with it when they're trying to ship imports or exports to the colonies to sell in the marketplace. So I think money and propaganda, or money and making claims beyond its simple function as a bearer of value and a medium of exchange is a big part of the topic. Yeah.
Why don't you go ahead and take that question about Bitcoin as well? Tell us, sort of extend that into the cryptocurrency conversation.
I can tell you, about 5 or 6 years ago, I'll make a admission, I actually opened a Bitcoin account when it was at like 1,100 or 1,200, and it had gone up from 900. And I ummed and ahed for about 3 or 4 months, thinking, "Oh, shall I put?" And I didn't buy anything because I was determined. I was convinced I'd probably lose, And oh boy, if I'd bought 4 or 5 Bitcoins back then, I'd be in a different shape now. The reason I was interested in Bitcoin was because I was reading about money in the 18th century, and Bitcoin takes us to a position that we haven't really been in since the 18th century, because Bitcoin depends on blockchain, the technology, and it basically allows us to trust, the other person, even though we don't know who they are, based on the Bitcoin transaction, without needing a bank, right? Without needing a third-party guarantor. And when I was reading about blockchain and Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is one function on the blockchain, right? Blockchain figures in all kinds of different stuff. But I thought, this is amazing because they're able to cut out the banks. And the banks, the Bank of England is formed in 1694, but the provincial and retail banking is 100 years away. And when the people I'm dealing with in the 17th and early 18th centuries, they are passing notes. They are passing bills of exchange, promissory notes, and dealing with each other on credit, basically on the basis of reputation. And that's one of the limits to their activities. They work in networks, credit networks, so they know a deal is good, and because they know the people they're dealing with. And they'll also accept a certain amount of wastage and falling out because that's the world they occupy. Well, then you get the banks, and then you get the different financial situation, all the way down to Bitcoin. And Bitcoin, I think, is massive. And I think it can't I mean, I wouldn't buy one for whatever it is now. What is it now, like 40 grand or something for a Bitcoin? I'm not sure. It's gone crazy. But I wish I'd got in at 1100.
For sure. Thank you. Here's the next question. This one comes from our good friend Khalil down at Texas Tech. He's wondering, I haven't heard you use the word capitalism once tonight. He's wondering if you
did.
Did you?
I snuck it in. I snuck it in when I said commercial society and early capitalism.
Yes, you did. That's correct. But tell us what you see about the future of capitalism in this context.
Well, that's a big question. I say to the students, I say commercial society and early capitalism because David Hume and Adam Smith, didn't talk about capitalism. They talked about commercial society and civil society. And capitalism is only something that is coined, mostly as a negative, I think, in the 1830s and the 1840s. I think it comes into currency. I'm not sure because there's too many different versions of capitalism. I think China and its capitalism is different from North America and its capitalism. The ups and downs of the system certainly don't augur well or look good for the longer term. But then the great strength of capitalism is its adaptability and the way in which Land Rover just announced that they're going to be carbon free and making electric cars in the next 20 years. And Marx, the greatest critic of capitalism, was also in many ways his biggest fan because he could see that the market is a really powerful social technology of its own, and actually imagining a future without some kind of market for deciding on the distribution of resources, I think is difficult. To conceive of. But the market, as it currently runs, is also difficult to conceive of that continuing for very long. Well, not for very long, but forever, just because of the climate and the environment, and also things like COVID, right? I mean, I said this on the talk I did with Robert at the National Humanities Center last year, the same thing. We are going to have to find some kind of value to restore the economic, fortunes of the West after this COVID disaster. And I don't see how we can keep having value untaxed and hidden away in offshore accounts, which has been siphoned off. And not being used in that collective way as value to circulate and get everybody back on top. And I think there's a big fight coming because the financial collapse was enormous, but COVID it makes it look like a lot less. And that's why I was interested in that Barry Eichengreen article from The Guardian, where he's saying, look at what the central bank is doing now, the way it's getting involved in, furloughing workers, keeping millions of people going. It's pushing really on the limits of what it should be doing in terms of maintaining a distance and a market relationship with which we're most familiar from the 19th century. But there's just too many changes to think that it will continue as it has been, for the last 100 years for the next.
We're going to go from that rather large question to something more specific and local. This is from Deb. Deb is in Chapel Hill, not far from me. Deb's curious if you can speak a little bit to the U.S. policy disconnect from gold by President Nixon in 1973. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's a really important moment in the history of money, in the 20th century history of money, because there was a great Hungarian political economist, anthropologist, political scientist called Karl Polanyi, who wrote a really interesting book called The Great Transformation, which wasn't much read at the time, but is increasingly being read now. And he argued that capitalism had a kind of a glory day from the late 18th century through to the early 20th century because of the gold standard and because of the consensus around monetary policy and because of the use of gold to peg the value of money. So credit was certain and people would invest with confidence because they knew they could make they could make a living and make a profit. And when the gold standard comes to the end of its consensus in the early 20th century, which is with the Great Depression, you get John Maynard Keynes coming up. And the really interesting thing about Keynes, and I got this out of the Skidelski book, is he basically shifts the attention of money away from it as a medium of exchange and to money as a store of value, and says the real problem with the Great Depression is that people are holding on to their money as a store of value. They're not spending it, and that's why we need the government to step in and deficit finance to get the economy going again. The argument of the general theory of money and employment that he produces in the 1930s, and which becomes more or less, every government in the Western world is more or less Keynesian thereafter, and still today, right? How that connects is that there is a post-war consensus around money in the West, in which, you know, the US provide a kind of revised gold standard position. The dollar's pegged to gold, and we're all pegged to the dollar, right? And so and we proceed through the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and so forth. And then for reasons to do with changings in the gold supply and the performance of the American economy in the wake of the Vietnam War and the problems, Nixon makes the decision to take America off gold. And I think out of that decision, you can see turmoil in Western European currency markets that leads to things like the euro, because the euro was an attempt to try and establish a kind of consensus again around money and values by having a common currency, and that brought its own set of problems, particularly for the Greeks after the collapse of 2008. So I would see that Nixon decision is in that trajectory. And the big question now is, how much longer can the dollar survive as the kind of global currency, and when will the Chinese, take that position? And that's a complicated one, because it doesn't just rely on markets and growth and volume, but it also relies on military power and geopolitics and things like that. And it all starts getting a bit scary, actually, when you reflect on the history going back over centuries, that these things often don't end well, when people fall out about these kinds of arrangements.
Thank you for that response. We've had a couple of questions about Bitcoin. It's one of those it's a word that probably most people have heard or have some sort of vague understanding of what it is. I wonder if you can address Mike's question in the queue, which is to maybe describe Bitcoin a little bit more, at least conceptually. Where does it go and how exactly does this work?
Well, it gets its value from the market, right? And what people are prepared to buy them for. As I understand it, Bitcoin, a Bitcoin is a very, 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 very long number, which is massive and very hard to generate. So the first thing is that there is a limited number of Bitcoins, right? And there are people who are farming them and creating them, but it takes a very long time, right? And so you've got a Bitcoin, which is a very, 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 very long number, right? And that can be sent from one person who's a node on the blockchain to another person who's on the node on the blockchain, and the receiving person can be confident that that is a non-counterfeitable, real representation of what it says it is, which is a Bitcoin, right? And so you've got basically a closed system where there are things called Bitcoins which people can trade with confidence, right? And at that point, you've got a monetary system, because you've got a measure of value and you've got something that can act as a medium of exchange and settle accounts if people are prepared to accept them. So it was a big news story the other day when Tesla, a bona fide corporation that makes things and sells things, says we're going into Bitcoin in a big way. And so they get their value because there is a limited number of them, and people will, pay, and they will also speculate on the likelihood that the value of these limited things will increase, just like any other thing that's sold in the market, and is limited.
And Just to be a little bit more elementary, even if anybody in our audience tonight has an extra 40 grand lying around, where would they get a Bitcoin? How do you even engage the market?
You can open an account. You can open an account, and then you can buy them, and people will sell them, There's online, that's what I did. I never bought one, shamefully, because I thought $1,100 or $1,200 was too much. Ha ha. And who knows? I mean, they are really interesting because they are global, and so if the Indian government decides, as it did the other day, last year or a couple of years ago, to cancel all of these major, banknotes because they can't track where the value is in the economy, and they want to try and get people to bring them to the bank so they can register that and tax them. People fled into monetary alternatives, and Bitcoin is that alternative. And now, the problem is, I guess they're getting so massive. People talk about half a Bitcoin and that kinds of thing. I'm not sure how that works. I had a student who told me the other day that he's got 2.5 Bitcoins. I think I'm in the wrong game. I wish I should be what you're doing. If you've got 2.5 Bitcoins and you're taking a class with me.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. It's an interesting transition from what many of us in the audience and in this conversation tonight associate with money, and still in my mind's eye, I'm either pushing my hand into my dungarees as a kid to find the coins, or you're opening your Velcro wallet to pull the bills out that have been saved there, to this kind of almost matrix-like idea of Bitcoins. And it's something that you've traced throughout this conversation tonight, but it is that ultimately it's that sense of value and confidence.
I think that's it. And the idea of money as a thing, a material thing, and coins and notes, even though we all know that we don't pay our bills like that anymore. When was the last time anybody got any money out, right? I mean, it's all contactless, and certainly you don't pay your university tuition or your gym memberships when we had them, or your bar bill or anything. It's all pieces of plastic these days and waving things at card readers and stuff. But this idea of money as a thing is a really powerful, in the popular mind, is really powerful. And I think that's why politicians can get away with saying crazy things like they did in England after the crash. On the Labour and the Conservative side, it's not a right and left thing. They're all doing the same thing, talking about running out of money. And one of the most interesting things that I read when I was reading up on this topic is, if you think of money as a measure of value, primarily and foundationally a measure of value, and all the other functions depend upon that foundational function. Because if it's not a measure of value, you can't have a medium of exchange, you can't have a store of value, and you can't have a means of settlement. And if you think of money as a measure of value, to say that we can run out of it is preposterous, because you can no more run out of money than you can run out of pounds and ounces or miles and yards. It's a measure of something rather than a thing itself. And that's, where I wanted us to get to, was just rethinking that position, and understanding and thinking about why it is we think too little or not often enough about these facets to money, because we live in this mythology, and we're talking about it in aphoristic terms, as I said earlier on.
Thank you, Simon. I've got one more question. I'm going to give the last one to Tisha. We're going to zoom back down a little bit more directly into a time period, and we wonder if you could talk a little bit more about trust in money and the relationship that institutions and the relationship to these institutions that issue it. For example, in the early 19th century, could you address Andrew Jackson and the Second Bank of the United States bank wars? Or can you give us an example around that of what you're describing in terms of this relationship?
Well, Jack, I mean, now you're asking me to reach into kind of one of the lectures I give on the survey of American history in Jacksonian America, which I haven't taught for a couple of years. So I'm reaching back into my mind and thinking about the bank war. as I understand it, Jackson lost his shirt in the panic of 1819, as did a lot. And the problem with banking at that time was that you got kind of banks that popped up in the States and that lent to people who wanted to invest in land that was being taken from the Native Americans. And then sell it to farmers who came out and then would get a mortgage, and then they'd pay off their mortgage with the harvest that they would send east to the cities that were growing in the east and using, ultimately railroads, but canals and other systems initially. And so Jackson was no fan of the bank because in 1819 the Bank of the United States had called in the loans that the state banks had taken out. And caused them to call in mortgages, and there was a kind of knock on and a credit crunch, and it was seen that the bank in Philadelphia was controlled by Eastern financial interests, and people thought that they were not thinking about the good of the Western farmers. They were just worrying about their own returns and their own Eastern interests, and so Jackson went on a war against the bank and had his pet banks, where he was put his federal funds. I think there was a lot of work done on this back in the 50s and 60s, and I think that the whole point about trust and belief is a very powerful one. But in 19th century money is in many ways even more chaotic than 18th century money. But I think the judgment of history is that Jackson's action, while popular, and he's often been compared to a recent incumbent in the White House, while popular, was actually very damaging for the economy and for the interests of the people that he supposedly represented, because he introduced more greater uncertainty around credit and more vicious swings and bust, which ultimately didn't do too many people very good. That's, I think, all I've got on Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. I said that Tisha would have the last question. I actually misled you. I've got one more question. I think this is relevant. This comes from Cindy. Cindy is representing an historical museum tonight. And she asks a question that if not our audience has, certainly younger people might have, which is, we've said several times that money is a measurement. We can't run out of it. If that's true, then why do we have crashes? Describe what an economic crash is then.
What, in the last 2.5 minutes?
That's great. You got 2.5 minutes. Go.
Yeah, thanks a lot, mate. Well, there are various views about why things go wrong. I'm persuaded by Marx, who argued that in pursuit of value, people invest and they compete, and they're always trying. Nothing grows forever, right? And if you think about it logically, it would be presumptuous to assume that you can always make more money than you did last year, and that's kind of the dynamic that capitalism works on. And in so doing, it often gets to the point whereby, in order to assure profits now, it has to borrow from the future, i.e., it takes out loans and credit, and it continues to try and compete, and it continues to try and do well. This is what the banks really did in 2000 and in the early 2000s. Banks make money from lending money, and they couldn't get their loans out quick enough. There was a massive growth and they were lending money to people who couldn't really pay it back, and then they were selling on these loans, these mortgages, the subprime mortgages, to other people, and then they were selling them on to other people, and they'd kind of collateralize these debt assets in pursuit of ever more gain. Well, at some point, somebody's going to raise a question on the value of the thing that's being offered for sale, and then the whole speculative confidence mountain falls down, and we have to kind of have a reset, and a lot of the value that was created gets wiped off, right? And the question is, who's responsible for that? Is it the corporations that took the positions and ran up the debts? Well, if we leave it to them and they all collapse, then we lose the financial system, and we all suffer. So we have to, it's argued, bail them out, and that's why crashes happen. And the most extraordinary thing about them is that every time they happen, people are like, "Who knew? Who could work? Who knew that was going to happen? And if and every 25 or 30 years or so, we have the same kind of charade.
Simon, thank you for that answer. Thank you for being generous with your time tonight. Of course, the big takeaway is that all of our audience is going to run out and buy Bitcoin now.
No, don't.
Nonetheless, in all seriousness, thank you for your time and your expertise. We really do appreciate what you've shared with us tonight.
Well, I've had enormous fun, and it was nice to meet everybody, and thanks for coming along.
And I want to thank our entire audience for joining us tonight. Please do follow our National Humanities Center social media feeds, both Facebook and Twitter, to find upcoming opportunities and resources that you can use in your teaching and in your learning. And I hope that includes the next webinar that we have scheduled. It's not for 10 days now, almost 10 days, February 25th. We'll be working in inviting Ann Rowland, who is a fellowship classmate of Simon's last year, and is a professor of English at University of Kansas. And she'll be speaking with us on the value of books in the age of social media. I hope you can join us, and if not, for the next one at one of our future webinars. Thank you again, everyone. Have a great day at school tomorrow. We'll see you next time at the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.
Cheerio.